Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shannon. I'm the founder of Marketplace Seller Courses, and I have with me today's special guest, Chris McCabe. He is the CEO and founder of ecommercechris.com. Chris formerly worked at Amazon on performance and policy enforcement teams, and he now uses that knowledge and experience to help sellers think like Amazon in order to better protect their accounts and businesses. So Chris, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shannon.
So what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the most common types of suspensions that we see, particularly affecting brands, manufacturers, and private labels. So I'm just going to kind of go down the list here and get any feedback from your expertise and experience. And then if there's any additional ones that you have to add, we can add those as well.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so the first one that I've typically seen is a lot of logistical things actually. So late shipments, for example, not including tracking information or order defect rate. Let's talk about those real quick. What are some things that you've seen that brands and manufacturers can do in terms of avoiding late shipments, tracking information, order defect rate?
I would say test your automation tools. If you think that you might have a problem, Amazon's not going to be that sympathetic as you fix it while you're on the clock. They sort of want you to test things, audit your processes, make sure that everything's 100% ready to go, even if you have a technical glitch. It's being manually observed. Somebody catches it, somebody fixes it quickly. They don't really have a lot of patience or tolerance for metrics misses. It used to just be in Q4 where they were really aggressive and intolerant, but now it's sort of all the time. So tracking information, they expect you to load that, have it. The tracking actually shows a delivery. And then in terms of ODR, I mean, that's a combination of your claims, negative feedback. They want to make sure that your metrics are within range and targeted, on target, across the board. And if you have a gap or a blip, in maybe your 30-day window, your 90 days, you're still solid. They expect every seller to attain that standard and maintain it. Most of the suspensions I work on aren't even performance metric related. They're policy teams, policy enforcement.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I've seen is that in terms of the different aspects of it, for each aspect of the seller account health, you have targets. And so Amazon will give you a little leverage. So if you miss a tracking number, for example, 1 out of 1,000 orders, it's not going to affect you at all. It's going to be fine. But there are performance metrics. And I had somebody ask me recently, they said, how often do you check your seller account health? And the answer is every day. Every day I go into the primary accounts and make sure that the seller account health is up to par. If there's anything that I see that could be questionable or suspect, we want to catch it before it gets too bad, and we want to work to prevent it. And we'll talk about that in the next section. Let's talk a little bit about communication with sellers. So I think, here's an example where Amazon has very specific policies in terms of why and when and how much you can communicate with the customers. And remember, again, these are Amazon's customers. They're not your customers. So the biggest ones that I see are you cannot provide external links. You cannot provide or attempt to redirect customers to your website, for example. You can't offer coupons or cross promotions or to upsell or cross-sell. Amazon's basic aspect or definition is you can only contact a customer in regards to the order that they purchased from you, and that's pretty much it. Do you have any thoughts in terms of those policies or aspects that you see?
I do. So when I was working there a few years ago, we called it diverting. That was the internal term for if you happen to include links, even unintentionally, right? It wasn't so much about malice of forethought. If you were including links that directed people off of Amazon and onto your own website, they considered that diverting sales, typically would send a warning, and people would say, oh yeah, I didn't realize I was doing that. I wasn't aware. I didn't know that was in the terms so far. But now they're a lot more, sensitive to it. They don't want people to, include a PDF. Hey, download our ebook. And then of course the ebook is full of special offers, discounts, links, things that might hurt your ability to, hurt Amazon's ability to keep buyers on the platform. Instead, you're just sending them to all these other places, right? YouTube videos, you're sending them to your site, you're sending them to special discount landing pages, whatever it might be. You're sending them away, and Amazon's trying to keep them right there. They want them to know your storefront. They want them to like and be familiar with your products, but they don't necessarily want, of course, unless you're paying Amazon, advertising fees and things like that, they don't want advertising to be done on the cheap and jumping people off the site like that. So diverting isn't as much of a problem now as it was when I was working there, but people are still trying to be sort of tricky, crafty in terms of, well, how can I get people, can I just say, well, I'm going to enhance the customer experience by giving you more information about these products? But Amazon kind of knows that, you're coloring outside the lines a little bit there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The two places that I've seen these warnings set, first and foremost, is because you can communicate through your email and it just, uses that Amazon alias. A lot of times people will send an email to a customer and their signature, just their email signature, will have their website and email address, and Amazon will strip that out. And I've seen people even get warnings for that. So just be wary that if you're communicating with customers and you're doing it through your email as opposed to within the platform, just go ahead and strip that signature out to make sure that you're only communicating with an Amazon and you're not providing other information. I think phone numbers are okay, customer service phone numbers, but avoid any email addresses or websites that you may include in your signature line.
Yeah, and something else to consider is, of course, a lot of competitors are buying from each other to see if there's a violation that they can report. If they're trying to, knock you off a listing or maybe even knock your account off. If they are buying for the purposes of seeing if you've stepped out of bounds and you show them something that's non-compliant, you can almost guarantee they're going to report it. And obviously, if it's actionable, then investigators will review it, they'll agree, and they'll send a warning. If there's multiple warnings like that, then they'll probably, size you up for a suspension on the spot. So a lot of people don't think about that.
Yeah, the other one I've seen is tracking information. So sometimes people have an automated system where they're providing the alias email address to FedEx or UPS or their shipping provider, and FedEx is trying to email the customer directly. And typically you'll get a notice because Amazon's, it qualifies every email address that is allowed to send to customers. So you probably don't want to include that link or allow that email address to send emails to customers, because the ones from FedEx almost always have website links. And even though it's for the purpose of tracking, the better goal is to simply upload that tracking number to the Amazon account, to the order, and Amazon will send that email out and let the customer know when their order is going to be.
Yeah, the direction that things are going, whether it's product reviews, asking for feedback, or anything else, is eventually we'll get to the point, 2019, 2020, Amazon will tell sellers, listen, we're going to handle asking people for this stuff. So you don't have to, send an extra email, but they don't want to get two emails. We'll handle the one email. And we'll handle the phrasing of it too, which is, that might be a dark day for some people, but I see that as the future. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I think there's just an aspect in general, a principle that I want to touch on, which is, you talked about people, one, trying to intentionally divert Amazon customers away from Amazon towards their website. My philosophy is if they're an Amazon customer, you want to keep them on Amazon 100%, because I work with a lot of companies, and if you're going to drive a best-selling product, you don't want them buying from your website. You want them buying from Amazon because it increases the conversion rate, it increases the number of reviews you get. So in my experience, your goal is always keep other Amazon clients on Amazon. If you want to get more website visitors, use your own methods to drive traffic there, but you want to keep people on Amazon because that's what's actually going to increase your sales and get exposure for even a bigger audience.
Yeah, I think some of it was driven by fear, maybe nowadays too, but back in the day, sellers were afraid they were too leveraged on Amazon. They were afraid they'd lose everything, and they didn't want to lose all their customers if they lost their Amazon account. It was just that simple connection to, if I get suspended, what if I can't get back on? I hear that writing appeals can be hard. I hear that getting reinstated without getting the same denial message 17 times in a row can be hard. What if that happens to me instead of somebody else? So I think they were trying to hedge their bets a little bit.
Which is ironic because by hedging your bets, if you violate an Amazon policy, you're almost guaranteeing the future. The goal is to have an online diversified strategy. You always want to be diversified, and that's probably the bigger conversation to have. And we've got a great webinar on that as well. Chris, let's talk a little bit about AtoZ Claims, what that means, what that looks like for sellers. And I know that there's a way to respond to those appropriately to get the best response both from the customer as well as Amazon. Let's talk about AtoZ Claims for a minute.
Claims are a bit, it's funny because I started in AtoZ Guarantee Claims in 2006. That was my first investigator role at Amazon before I went into merchant risk and seller performance teams. And I saw a lot of interesting things. I mean, I read the buyer side of the story. I read the seller side of the story. And back in those days, they more or less told us, unless you really think that the buyer's way off base, you're either arranging for a return so the seller gets their item back and issues the refund, or you're debiting the seller for this because it's a bad buyer experience and the seller didn't really come back with a convincing enough story about why this was the buyer's fault. I mean, pro-buyer experience, right? I work with a lot of large sellers, I suppose, who can afford to just refund these and to make sure that there won't be, first of all, a chargeback down the road from the buyer, but there won't be any headaches in terms of messages to customer service, made up stories about, hey, I lost the claim, but this item was fake and I'm going to write a product review, kind of that menacing approach that some people have when they just want to get back at somebody because their return wasn't accepted, the refund didn't go through. So to avoid all that mess, I have most of my clients, as long as it's not completely way off base, issuing the refund for the good of all parties, because Amazon's, a pro-buyer marketplace, right? So
let me ask you a follow-up question to that,
yeah.
because I think that's really important. If somebody submits an AtoZ claim, we have phenomenal customer service people that we work with that will bend over backwards to guarantee and ensure the Amazon customer experience. So that's always our top goal. So if there was an issue with the product, we'll replace it. If there's a problem, we'll refund it. Is there a difference in terms of the account health of just issuing a refund on an AtoZ claim versus asking the Amazon customer to actually retract that claim?
I mean, if you think you can work it out with the buyer, you can certainly ask them. I wouldn't do that as a blanket policy, trying to get everyone to retract. I mean, pick your battles, I guess is the short answer. Some of them just take a look at it, size it up. If it's going to be a big headache, if it's not that much money, refund it. Cost of doing business on Amazon, it's been that way for a while. Other cases, be strategic about it. You might have a higher value item. You might have a buyer who's, more interested in communicating with you, more willing to message you back. If you've got questions for them, maybe they've got questions for you. I mean, a lot of times you're trying not to have too many messages going back and forth because Amazon's counting the contacts per order, right? But beyond that, you can work it out. If you've got, send a message, see if they're willing to engage. If they're not from the first message, then you're kind of abandoning the effort at that point.
Is there a difference? Is it better for your seller account health if they retract it versus if you just settle it and issue the refund? Or is it basically the same resolution in Amazon's eyes and they're just happy that you dealt with the customer in a positive manner?
Yeah, I mean, technically it's better if they retract it, but you want to be judicious about trying to get people to retract it. You don't want to start getting to the point where you want everyone to retract and then you're sending them too many messages and then they complain about that. That things can spin out of control quickly. So, obviously if the buyer withdraws the claim, that's the best. You've managed to work up the return or the refund. You didn't have to go through the claim system. It's less headache for Amazon as well.
Yeah. So, basic principles here are customer service. You need to have somebody checking the customer service messages every single day. You want to make sure you're being as
7 days a week
as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And you always want to make sure that you give the customer the benefit of the doubt. I know sellers who they're like, oh, I can't believe they want a refund or they're challenging me on this. And I say, you have to look at the big picture. You're talking to somebody who's asking for a refund for $34.95. And what you want to avoid is negative seller feedback, negative product reviews because somebody had a bad experience. You have to look at the bigger picture, for whatever amount it is over the course of a month, you're going to write it off because over the course of time, if you provide superior customer service, you are going to sell more product. That's just a baseline that I've always seen. So go out of your way, provide superior customer service. That's part of the backbone of Amazon. And if you fall in line with that, you're going to be more successful and you're going to have fewer problems with Amazon.
Right. I mean, and just as a follow-up point, I think some sellers lose sight of some of that while they're considering what's fair and what the buyer's trying to get for free and that sort of thing. What if it's a first-time buyer who's going to come back? Maybe it's an item they're going to need many more times in the future. Yeah. So some of these resolutions do result in 10, 11 more sales that you wouldn't have had if you really made life hard for the buyer. I mean, maybe not every buyer is just trying to game the system. So think some of the long-term consequences through before you throw down on everybody, because it's not always about a philosophical discussion about what's fair on Amazon and what power buyers have over refunds or claims. You might be right. I mean, there are people who come to me with those types of arguments, and maybe it's not about a claim or a buyer. Maybe it's about their relationship with Amazon. I might agree with them but you have to have a holistic approach to, what is this really worth? Is this the battle that you want to fight to the death, right?
Yeah. And I mean, just the sellers that I work with, the better you understand Amazon, the better you'll understand relationship, the more successful you'll be in doing that relationship.
Right.
And so we had a company that we took, they had just started off a brand that hadn't been selling on Amazon for 25 years. They decided to do it directly, but because they understood it and worked well with Amazon and played within the Amazon system, they became $1 million business on Amazon within 15 months. And it was all legitimate.
Exactly.
And it was all done correctly. And we're leveraging best sellers, number one best sellers now. So
yeah. I mean, that's a lot of the coaching I wind up doing. I mean, plenty of people associate me with suspensions and reinstatement work and writing appeals and so forth. First of all, most of my clients are active sellers. So I might work on reinstatement work, but it's ASIN level reinstatement, right? They get their top selling ASIN suspended and they stay active. Maybe some of them have never been suspended. But it's that communication, and building the relationship, understanding how Amazon wants you to communicate with them. And I've worked with, I don't know how many private label sellers that started off with maybe 800,000 a year, 1.2 million, then you start doing doubling year over year, 2.4, 3.6. And before you know it, they're 3 or 4 years in. I mean, I'm sure you talk to people about this all the time, right? Before you know it, they're at 8 or, 7, 8, 9, 10 million a year. And that's because they understood their relationship to Amazon. They understood what's important to Amazon, and they knew how to communicate, and they grew in that responsible, smart way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You touched on this briefly. I want to touch back on it. You talked about like individual listing suspensions or suppressed listings. So that's different than account suspension. Can you talk about what an individual suppression looks like versus an account suspension and how those are best?
So you mean like a restriction? Yeah. Well, I mean, suppressed listings are listings that nobody can list, right? So like restricted products, things like that. They're taking those items out of the catalog. They don't want anyone to list or sell them for various reasons. It could be an ingredient in the consumable. It could be a safety defect that they've identified in that particular product, or even just similar products to it. So in terms of ASIN level suspensions, people receive notifications and lose top selling ASINs all the time. The process is largely the same in terms of how you write a plan of action and get that ASIN back. Most of the same steps are what you go through just as you would on an account suspension. So, of course, if I help somebody get their account fully reinstated and they have an ASIN level suspension later on, could be an item quality complaint, could be a safety complaint, return rates that are too high, whatever it might be, it's largely the same approach in terms of identifying causes and proposing solutions.
Yeah, and the other two that I've seen that might be a little different or just use a different language. So one type of listing suppression that I've seen is, for example, if you have images that aren't up to spec, or maybe if you include language in the listing, like a promotional offer, or only buy from the seller, Amazon will suppress the listing temporarily until you fix that issue, and then they'll reactivate it.
Yeah, and a lot of that is just compliance that maybe certain companies or certain Amazon account managers don't notice a policy change, or they just didn't understand how titles need to be created to begin with. Maybe it was delegated to somebody else who had been doing it. Gaps in process like that, and that's why a part of your appeal needs to identify what those gaps were and why they happened, and then of course the rest of it's solutions, how you're going to fix that so it never comes up again.
Yeah, the other one I've seen is, it's happened a couple times. One, an example where just the warehouse had actually accidentally used the wrong FNSKU label and had sent in the wrong product. So all of a sudden we started getting all these returns and complaints because they had ordered one product and we're getting another one. So Amazon sent us notice, had us pause that. We actually had to request the inventory back so we can fix those labels. And in that case, it's temporary. Amazon's notifying you to fix it. And then in the second issue, it was just a bunch of random customer complaints. I think it was returns. And it was something like, oh, well, we already had one of these. I didn't realize it. We're returning it. Somebody said I didn't like the color. And somebody else said it was damaged. But Amazon algorithmically flagged all of those and basically paused it. And they put it in our court. They said, you're allowed, to basically state why this was an issue, pick which issue it was and fix it.
Right.
You can essentially reinstate it yourself, but we want to make you aware of it. So if there's a systematic problem, you don't keep selling those, and you can put a pause on it if you need to.
That's exactly right. Yes.
So
we see the same things.
Yeah. So those are in terms of the suppressed listings or individual listings.
Yeah.
Chris, let's move on to the second component, which is what we can do or what sellers can do to proactively prevent suspension on Amazon. So I'm just going to go through the list. We've touched on a couple of them already, but let's go through, because there's two types of dealing with Amazon. One is prevention and the other is intervention. And prevention is always cheaper and more cost effective than intervention. So let's talk about seller account health monitoring. And you mentioned the shipping and inventory integrations and making sure that's all up to code. But let's touch briefly on what people can do to proactively prevent suspension, looking at those two things.
Well, you definitely follow along with your notifications. You don't ignore them. You communicate back when you're warned for something. If you do receive a notice that you've got return rates that are too high for a particular item, and you check out some of the comments, I mean, you take that seriously. You do something about it. They want to see you acting, as opposed to sitting back and letting these messages, these alerts pile up on your account. But some people, if they don't lose the listing, they don't take it seriously. Some people, if they get warned like a notice claim of infringement, and they just think to themselves, well, I'm not going to sell that item anymore, so I don't really have to reach out to the right seller. And, when it comes to infringement cases, those are things that hit, whether you're private label or reselling. The infringements might be a little bit different, but it's an issue for everybody. Anybody could get a patent warning. Anyone could get a copyright warning on an image, or depends on what it might be, but an intellectual property complaint. So that could hit a private label seller too. You have to be prepared for these things. I think what some sellers don't understand is that you can't just wait until it happens to you. You have to kind of think ahead in terms of, am I vulnerable to somebody saying I infringed upon their patent, before you get into all the design issues, before you get all the manufacturing done. Have you put all your ducks in a row? Because if you needed legal advice somewhere in that process, and you either got poor legal advice, which is kind of rampant in the Amazon world, or you didn't understand the legal advice you got and you misinterpreted it and made a mistake, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix that mistake. And it could be a very painful process to go through, aside from whether or not you actually get suspended for it, right? Once you get the warnings, then okay, at least react to them, at least do something, say something, know how to respond. If you're not sure how to respond to certain kind of notice claims, for instance, or we talked about safety violations early, then I guess that's what you're referring to in terms of intervention, right? Then at least find somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, which I know can be hard these days, but find somebody who understands what's behind a safety violation. Don't just say, we test our products, we know they're safe. Here's a bunch of FDA documents to show that these consumables are good to be sold in the United States. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, I actually had a brand that I worked with, and they had a bottle that they had licensed from the manufacturers, kind of, company that would make a type of bottle, and they would license companies to put their logo on it. And so all of a sudden they got a patent infringement notice because the company had just sort of sent them out somewhat arbitrarily to every, bottle that looked exactly like theirs. And of course it was in fact their bottle, but they had a license to use it. And it was a very simple method of contacting the brand owner, contacting the company that they had licensed it from, and they issued the retraction, and it was a done deal. So it can happen to anybody. And I've seen, suspensions come from all kinds of things, where a seller was selling on a listing and somebody else made a change to that listing, and everybody received a notice, but that wasn't fixed. And their account got shut down for one day, but it was a $20,000 loss.
Sure.
It's knowing ahead of time what to do in those situations to protect yourself.
Right. And also, if you're not legally trained, don't make a legally based decision, right? Just because you don't tell yourself what you want to hear just because it's more cost effective that way, or kind of putting it out of your mind won't necessarily make it go away. I mean, and I'm not an attorney myself, but I mean, I've got, one or two good ones I can refer you to if you really need legal advice that makes sense and is reliable. Because if you take on, it's the same with people who get suspended and they want to take 4, 5, 6 stabs at getting themselves reinstated, right? They want to, I've written appeals before and I got my ASIN back, so this is pretty much the same thing. And they try 6, 7, 8 of these, and then they go looking for the help. It's kind of too late at that point. You don't want to sort of, I'm all for DIY as long as you're doing it the right way, doing it responsibly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In terms of the shipping and inventory integrations, I just want to mention, so, you have to have some redundancies. You have to have some backups. No software is perfect. And we've worked with warehouses where the warehouse was functional, but there was a issue on their end And even though they
Right.
actually shipped out all of the product on time, their system failed to upload the tracking information. Amazon didn't care that it was shipped out 5 days ago.
That's right.
Because it wasn't entered 5 days ago. So you can't retroactively put that in. So you have to be monitoring this on a daily basis. If you have a customer service rep, have them go in, have them look at the orders. If they're merchant fulfilled, make sure that they're shipping on time, make sure tracking numbers are going in. It's a very, very low cost for the benefit that you get. And it doesn't require a lot of training to make sure that they're answering all the customer messages and double checking on the seller account health and orders and make sure that all those integrations are still in place and working correctly.
And there's different companies, there's different kinds of integration, but and they work in different ways, but set up some alerts, set up some flags so that you'll, something starts looking or getting out of whack, you get an email and you get somebody on it and you task some operations personnel to figure out, I mean, there's a couple of responses. You need to fix the problem, and then you might actually be sending an email to Seller Performance, hey, you know, we had a technical glitch, we identified the problem, we've already put the solution into place. That's a big thing to tell them. And they might go a little bit easier on you. You might get an automated warning as opposed to a suspension. Q4 holiday, they have systems set up so that if your late ship goes over 4%, a certain number of those sellers will just be automatically suspended. I mean, that's why you can't necessarily plan to just get a warning and explain what happened or that it was some sort of storm or snowstorm or act of God. I mean, it doesn't really work that way. It's certain times of the year, you're just on your own. You're either getting it done or you're not, and they don't really care about the story.
Yeah, it's really important. So again, we've touched on this before, but fast and efficient customer service. Make sure you have a well-trained customer service rep who knows how to respond to customers, who knows policy-wise what they can and cannot do, what they can and cannot ask customers to do. I see a lot of issues with that. Make sure your customer service people are well-trained. And then make sure you're abiding by Amazon policy. And this is a key aspect that's so important because there is literally so much policy to know, and it changes all the time that you can't just rely on, you know, one-off webinars here and there to keep you up to date. The seminars and events and the workshops are really, really good, but you have to make sure that you're getting updates. When Amazon updates a policy in particular, you want to make sure that you're implementing that into your training, into your core process and response, because again, that's a violation waiting to happen. And if you can prevent it, it's going to be much more cost effective than if you have to wait to fix it later.
Right. And they want people proactive. They don't want to see that you're just reacting to things, that you only move when you've been warned for something. So whether it's in-house compliance experts that you hire and train or somebody outside, I mean, compliance is a big deal and it's something you want to pay attention to. You don't want to just set it and forget it and kind of forget to stay on top of this stuff, because to them, this is a 24-hour, 7 days a week experience. It certainly is for buyers. So anything buyers might be doing 24 hours, 7 days a week, they want you to be ready for too.
Now, you mentioned this before, but you talked about responding to all notices quickly. Notices show up in the seller performance notifications at the top. And again, I've had sellers that they were too busy running their business that one of the customer service people logged on, didn't notice it, didn't see it, they didn't respond to it. Is there a way that you can ensure that as maybe the owner of the business or whatever, that you're getting those performance notifications, or is it simply a matter of training your people to recognize when those come through and make sure that they're flagging them and those are going up the chain of command to be dealt with very quickly?
Well, I mean, if you're an owner of a business, don't be disengaged and just hire an Amazon account manager and assume that they're going to keep you informed on everything all the time. I mean, you should be familiar with Seller Central anyway. And you should be able to, I mean, it's very easy to sign in, go straight to the performance tab and go into the notifications and read if you have anything important. I mean, that takes seconds, right? You probably, if you're an owner of a business and you're busy doing the things you just described, you're not necessarily signing into the account every day, but check in with whoever is delegated that responsibility, because if they're not signing in every day, you probably have a problem. Keep an eye on your inbox. I mean, I don't know what your inbox is like, Shannon. I miss things sometimes. I mean, I'm getting dozens of emails. It depends on the day and what's going on in Amazon land. I might be getting dozens of emails that day, or even a dozen in 1 hour. It's easy for me to miss little alerts on certain days if I'm not paying attention or if my assistant isn't, backing me up. So I would have just anything Amazon account related. I would have a system of checks and built-in backups and maybe audits of processes. Was there an email that came in couple days ago and we missed it until today. Why did that happen? Was somebody not in that day and they were the one responsible for reading notifications? So, it sounds like a small thing, but it can be really important what if they gave you 48 hours to correct a problem? What if you had things wildly out of whack in terms of pricing errors? It's just something that you have to be paying attention to all the time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll work on putting together, I think, a resource that would track, where those emails come from, things that are specific in terms of the subject line that would allow people to set up a rule in their Gmail or their Outlook that would flag it, that would make it important, that would forward it to multiple people on the team. Because the faster you're able to respond to that, the more you're going to be able to drive off and prevent any negative
Right, because none of us know what tomorrow will bring. If you think, well, I got a warning on Monday and I've got a conference or a business meeting I'm going in until Wednesday, so we'll probably have that one warning from seller performance wrapped up by Thursday, and as long as it's within 3 days, I'm comfortable with that. Well, what if while you're working on the first one, another one comes in? You know what I mean?
Right.
Then you're fighting a two-front war. And does that mean you're only going to do 50% of what you would have done previously in terms of the work and the resolution because you've got two things to deal with, or are they the same thing and you're going to reply mentioning both ASINs in the same email? It starts getting strategic and it starts getting tricky pretty quickly.
So let's talk about this last aspect, and this is really important. You mentioned this before. I've had a couple experiences that I'll relate, but we talked about proactively contacting seller performance. And I'll tell you the two stories where this happened. The first one was we had affiliates that got a hold of our video of a product that we had produced, and the thing went viral. It got 30 million views in about a week, and all the traffic went to Amazon. They used Amazon affiliate links, and within a matter of days, we had sold something like 20,000 units. And even though we jumped on, we were aware of it, we started increasing the lead time from 2 days to 3 days to 4 days to 5 days. Even with multiple warehouses working at full capacity, we were not able to get all these orders out on time. And I was able to do the calculations and say, here's our on-time shipment rate. Here's how many orders we left. Here's how many we're going to be behind. We're going to go over. And I just knew that. And so I crafted a very careful email to seller performance. I explained exactly what happened. I explained the anomaly of it. I showed them in ShipStation that it showed our orders pulling in. It was 103,000% increase from the week before. So I think you can take that with a grain of salt and say, this is not typical.
Nice.
And I basically said, here's how we're dealing with it. Here's how we're fixing the problem. And it was actually the first time I've ever gotten a proactive email back from seller performance. And they said, hey, thanks for letting us know. I think they were just so impressed by the story, they actually responded. But the other time, it was a company where the inventory had not been updated correctly. It was done by manual entry. It went over a weekend. By Monday morning, we realized we'd oversold. We looked at the cancellation rate. We knew we were going to be over. And again, we crafted that email to seller performance ahead of time, basically detailing everything we would have done had our account been suspended, and said, here is the issue. Here's how we fixed it. Here's how we are going to systematically avoid that in the future. And in both cases, our account wasn't suspended. So I'm not saying it works every time, but I think that is something that people need to be aware of. You can be proactive and not just sit back and cross your fingers and hope your account doesn't get suspended.
I completely agree, and I believe in that proactive philosophy entirely. And the people that are, afraid to talk to Amazon about something that they're going to discover anyway, I don't want to draw their attention to it. Well, if your metrics wildly missed, their attention's probably their automated systems and triggers to draw their attention to it. I don't know. People call this different things, but the poking the dragon, I guess that's the one that's used the most. I suppose there are outlier examples where maybe, letting it go would have been a better idea. 1% of the time, 99% of the time, doing exactly what you just described is what I would recommend.
Yeah, and I think there's an aspect of that as well. When you do reach out to them, there's actually different email addresses for the different seller performance in different countries. So if you're selling in the UK or Canada or Europe, and I'll provide those in the resources as well. If it's a Europe issue and all of Europe had a suspension problem, then you actually need to reach out to all of those. But there is something that is really effective about contacting them ahead of time. And I've seen that work well when you know what you're doing and when you phrase it correctly and know how to address that. You
mentioned the canceled orders, I'm curious just about that. Was that you where you considered canceling them and you didn't, you just took the loss from fulfilling. You had to cancel because you simply didn't have the inventory?
Yeah, in that case, they actually had run out of inventory, and so we had to cancel a certain amount of orders. And we actually did it strategically. We were trying to get additional inventory in. We were seeing if we could get additional inventory. So we canceled just the bare minimum that we had to do the first day. We canceled just the bare minimum that we had to do the second day. And by the third day, we realized we're not going to get inventory. We're going to have to cancel the rest of these. That's going to put us over. We reached out, and it was
oh, great. So it's a happy story. Yeah.
It was. Yeah. Chris, let's get into the third part and talk about creating a successful reinstatement request, or what's known as a plan of action, or POA. You got about 4 steps that you kind of list and outline. The first is, what is a plan of action? And I'm just going to kind of let you go through these and define them, and let's provide whatever valuable insight you have, seeing as how you worked in seller performance at Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, what it is, I mean, most of your viewers and listeners probably understand that this term has been around for a while. There's a lot more information about what it is, yet my team still sees a lot of interesting ones, so to put it charitably. It's supposed to be a page and a half document. It's formatted a very specific way, bullets, numbers, certainly not bullets that have 2 or 3 words after them saying, we fixed this, but getting into a bit more detail. They want you to address the causes of your suspension, of course, whether or not you agree that they've given you enough information about what happened. They've already come to the conclusion that the account was worthy of a suspension, so they don't want to tell you exactly everything you need to write in this document. You've got to do some rooting around, digging for the causes of maybe it was an item quality issue. Why were so many people complaining about the product not working, not being what they expected, not being worth the price they paid for it, for example? Why did it happen? They don't want to hear the what. A lot of people, when they have to give the causes of the suspension in the first part of a POA, plan of action, they simply say what they were suspended for. I mean, Amazon already knows what you're suspended for. They're the ones who suspended you. So they want to get the why, right? They want to hear the how. I mean, that's where you have to, the rubber meets the road. That's where you have to kind of do your homework and show them that you know what's going on. If you haven't really identified the root causes, they might not even get to your plan of action below it where the solutions are present. So that's kind of a summary of how I would summarize plan of action. You want your best writer. You don't want to necessarily have the business owner writing this just because they're the most important person in the company, or maybe you don't want the Amazon account manager, or maybe you don't want, what you do want is the person who's the best writer, the best at presenting ideas clearly, directly, concisely, because again, using bullets and numbers, you have a small amount of space to convey very specific ideas and information. And if they're too vague, and if you just say, we're planning to do this, or you're describing incomplete actions, you're going to lose your reader, which is your audience, the investigator, very quickly. And they've got a lot of incentive to just skip past you and get on to the next person. So don't just say we've made a lot of improvements and then never mention what they are. I mean, you have to mention what they are, and you have to give credible improvements. So you're not just talking about, you've talked a lot today about customer service. I see a lot of POAs that include commentary about how wonderful their customer service is, but the suspension had nothing to do with getting back to customers quickly. So give them something they can use. If they're going to consider your reinstatement, they need material that specifically addresses what they expect to see from you, not generic template type stuff. I mean, customized, tailored language for your specific case. There are themes that present themselves over and over in a variety of different plans of action that I see. But if it starts to sound tinny to their ear, like something that you just came up with because you thought they wanted to hear it, it's not going to get the job done, right? So that's kind of some background on how to write it, what it is. In terms of the solutions, just make sure they're convincing, because it's easy for them to just kind of push a button saying we need more information, or this isn't good enough, come back to us when you have more. Don't expect them to give you a lot of details about what you're missing, right? In terms of, well, you gave us 3 good bullets there, but there's 3 more that we need, and they need to say this. I mean, we'd love to have it all served up on a platter like that, but they're not going to do that. They don't do it for a reason. They need you to go through the sort of the growing pains of figuring out what might have gone wrong and how you've remedied it. I've seen a lot of kind of crazy, people saying, well, I need more information before I can write this appeal, and asking them for more when they've given you all they're going to give you, which might just be a couple of ASINs or might just be one sentence that describes what they think you did wrong. And I see a lot of content that just has nothing to do with the suspension cause. We've been selling for X number of years. I wish I could tell you that selling for 10 years versus 10 months means a lot to them. It doesn't seem to anymore.
Yeah.
Or even revenue levels. I mean, it's supposed to be a level playing field where if you're selling 1 million a year or 25 million a year, you're more or less treated the same. We may or may not agree that that's what happens in practice, but they are supposed to be just as tough on somebody who sells 20 million a year who's done the same violation that you have. So just keep these things in mind. Don't think you're going to send them a snow job on how great your metrics are when it's not a metrics-based suspension.
Yeah, there's two comments on that. The first is Amazon can send template emails. You can't. It doesn't work both ways. But it's important. It's important to understand the game. And forget fair. It's not about being fair. It's about how the platform works. And the better you can understand that and the better you can leverage that, the more successful you will be guaranteed. The second one is...
And it's better for you too. I mean, you're not trying to trick them into something. What if the same problem comes up next month? They'll just be suspended all over again, and they're wonder why they reinstated you the first time. So it's better for you to get at the root causes of what went wrong, just so you can fix it permanently. I mean, they're not looking for short-term solutions. They want long-term ones.
And that's a really good point, Chris. I worked with a seller and had been suspended. I think it was for late shipments. And they wrote the plan of action and all the things that they were going to do different. And then a month later, they were suspended for the exact same thing. Now Amazon has even less incentive because all the things that you said you were going to do, you didn't do. So the bottom line here is don't bluff. Amazon will catch it. If you're going to make strategic changes, actually make those changes. If you say that you're going to do something different to prevent this from happening, make sure that you actually implement those strategies. The second one is very, very simple. Amazon works off algorithms. That's why A9, the search engine, is actually shorthand for algorithms. That's what it stands for. And so everything Amazon does, you have to remove that level of emotion. And you talked about not getting emotional and bringing a bunch of information and content into our conversation that's irrelevant. It's not a love letter. Your goal is to look at the facts. An algorithm is what suspended you. It's not that Amazon's out to get you. They don't care about why, what happened per se. But you have to address it systematically. So I've seen people write, reinstatement plans or plans of action with typos in them, providing limited information. They're upset. You have to take the time to make sure that you address it correctly. And I would say, well, you want to make sure it's accurate and you want to address it within a time period. And sometimes Amazon gives you a time period that you need to address it. Don't wait 6 weeks to address it. But at the same time, grab a couple coworkers, look at it, and fire off an email to Seller Performance in 10 minutes is also probably not a good idea. You want to make sure we do it correctly. Let's talk a little bit about the second point that you meant, which is how to address the POA. What does that look like?
Well, I mean, the format is going to be basically causes and solutions. I mean, I would suggest an introduction that gives a few lines to set them up for what they're about to read, for one thing, because they're reading these things nonstop all day, but also gives them the sense that you've made corrections and that they are going to see just how complete your actions were. You've already implemented them, and they're, like I said earlier, convincing. They won't have to come back and look at your account 3 weeks later. I mean, it's sort of a mark against that investigator if you give them a flimsy POA and they reinstate you, and then they get resuspended 3 weeks later. It sort of makes that investigator look bad for not pushing you for a bit more information and a bit more indication that you understood the nature of the problem to begin with. So the one-page format, I mean, sometimes we go to a page and a half if we're providing some new supplier information. For example, you're dumping your old suppliers because of the bad batches of product you got there. You're vetting suppliers differently. You've got new suppliers. So there might be some additional information that will lengthen it to a page and a half, but you generally, 90-something% of the time, you do not need any more space than that. And they're really reviewing these quickly. You can't assume, I don't know why I still see POAs people write that are 3-4 pages long. I mean, they never read those. They don't have that kind of time. Investigators have metrics just like you do. So I know it's tempting to cram everything you've ever done or seen on your Amazon account from 2016 into a suspension letter you have to write from a suspension last week, but it doesn't work that way. Economy of words, you have to, that's why I said your best writer. I mean, somebody who's not going to tell a long story when you can grab somebody else at the company who can write something and communicate the same ideas in 2 or 3 lines. That's what you need, that format, bullets and numbers.
Yeah, there's a poet, I forget, he said, I apologize for writing you a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. And I think the same thing applies. Like, you have to work hard to make it very concise, deal with the logic, address the issues. Ignorance is not an excuse. You have to know your business, and you have to understand Amazon business. And in the case that it was a policy violation that you were unaware of, I admit, I would guess that, admitting that and being able to proactively put into place solutions is going to be the best way to do that. One of the things that people have to consider, again, is if you look at the infrastructure of Amazon, the integration with the warehouses, the one-click, checkout, all of these things that they've done, they have built incredible systems. I ordered a sunglasses, case the other day, and it literally took me 30 seconds. I was, in the kitchen. I scrolled through my phone. I did the search. I found one that I liked. One-click checkout. 2 days later, it showed up. Amazon loves systems. The better your internal systems can be for your business, the better you're going to be able to operate with Amazon. If you don't have internal business processes and systems and integrations instead of doing everything manually, the better and more successful you're likely to be on Amazon. And that's just really key in terms of ordering inventory, in terms of the customer service. Make sure you have those systems in place. The better your internal systems are, the better your success on Amazon will be, for sure.
And be ready to either fix them if they break or describe them, because, like, I agree with what you said. I mean, audit things, test systems. I think sellers should mimic Amazon and have as many systems in place as possible with a human, maybe an automated element, sure, might be better than risking human error, but a human element, manual direction, management somewhere in there to make sure that automated processes aren't running wild and accurately. Audit these methods of getting work done and make sure you test them before you even roll them out, right? So.
Chris, let's talk about the last aspect, which is how to submit. What are some of your best practices and advice for actually submitting that plan of action for reinstatement?
Yeah, and this one's tricky. I've seen a lot of change in terms of how people observe, like the appeal button, for instance. You said a moment ago, some people want to reply in 10 minutes. I mean, some of that's anxiety and emotion. They think that the quicker they appeal, the faster they'll get their account back. That's true 0.05% of the time. Because most people take a step back, think about it, go through some of the things we talked about today. Your odds greatly improve. And just because you have a tempting button there, don't press it and just look at their instructions. I mean, a lot of what they tell you to do to appeal, some of the generic information they give you, plays almost no role into how I help someone format a plan of action. They don't give you the format that I use necessarily. So some people think that they're just sort of filling in blanks. Well, they ask me for this, I'll give them that. And they're asking me for some other information here. The appeal button, you can't even attach anything, right? You can't even show them invoices and authenticity letters that way, for instance. So you just have to kind of back off from that. If you get stuck, if they don't answer you right away, don't immediately write seller performance saying, where's my answer? I've been suspended for 6 hours now, as if their email queues have no contacts in them. And, investigators are sitting around waiting for an email from you. I mean, understand, like I said earlier, your audience. Don't spam them. Don't give them lots of sort of extraneous information they can't use, like you said before, emotion. There's wild misunderstandings about, you sent in the appeal, nobody got back to you, or they got back to you asking for more information. Escalation time. Now we have to escalate. We have to write to Jeff. We have to write to Jeff's dog. This isn't how it works. Right. It might feel better. I understand there's a therapeutic value. Your energy level is up and you're panicking to an extent, but decisions made while you're panicking are probably not as sound as the ones where you, like I said, step back, take some time, go over what you've written, write a draft, and then maybe read through it, make some edits before you, just like if you were writing a school paper, right? It's sort of the same concept, because you only have so many cracks at it. If you start going in this direction, going in that direction, trying to guess what they want to hear, even making things up because you think you don't understand why you're suspended. So we're just going to tell them what we think they want to hear, but none of it's even true. I mean, these are bad decisions, right? Then you just get stuck in these cycles where they're asking you for real information and you're just hopping from one foot to the next.
Is there any validity in sort of the statement that your initial plan of action is the most likely to reinstate your account, or is that sort of a fallacy and it just depends on the account and the situation, that there may be some follow-up that's required and a couple emails after they request more information, you submit the follow-up that they ask for, or in some cases, like you mentioned, they may ask for documentation. So in one case, the seller was selling on a listing, somebody added a completely irrelevant product to a child variation, it messed up the listing for everybody, and they were able to upload the flat file to show their contribution to the listing, to show that they didn't have a part of that. Is there anything in terms of wanting to put your best foot forward in terms of the first response, getting the best response from Amazon?
I mean, I would say percentage-wise, most sellers aren't reinstated on their first pass. If you nail it and you get everything that they wanted to see on the first one and you've addressed all the relevant issues to your suspension, your odds of sailing through on one try are greatly improved. I mean, we have plenty of people who, some of them are even surprised after all the terrible things they've heard out there, that we've managed to, get them back on in one shot. But it doesn't happen every time. Usually there's a revised plan of action, a second plan, a tweaked plan. Maybe you do a little research, find out that there's something you missed, and you can kind of go back, reformulate things a little bit. You're certainly not just moving words around and taking one bullet that was at the top, putting it at the bottom and switching it and then sending the same plan in. I mean, one thing I'd like to emphasize is I know there are people out there that are, I guess, would-be experts or escalation experts or plan of action experts who are pretty much just writing one plan for a client and telling them to send it everywhere. They don't modify it at all. They just have you send the same plan that might have only been 50% of the way there to begin with to a bunch of different people, because it's like, I guess this like statistical approach where, well, 1 out of 100 people that reads this is going to think it's valid and reinstate the account based on that. I can't emphasize this enough to dissuade people from only writing one plan, and then if it's rejected, just writing the same plan to Jeff saying, nobody read our appeal, nobody reviewed it, we got a standard automated response. I mean, that's the best way to guarantee that you're just going to be stuck for a long time. They will keep you suspended until you get it. If you keep showing that you don't understand how they work, that you don't understand that you missed certain key pieces of information the first time around, they're not going to be badgered into taking a subpar plan of action. So those are my words of caution.
Yeah, they're not hurting for one seller. Chris, this is going to be different for every seller, but at what point would you suggest bringing an expert on to help with the plan of action? And I think in some cases it's going to be the first one. And in some cases, for sellers who are more experienced, who are aware of it, they reach out, they communicate with Amazon. After a couple times, they realize they're not getting anywhere, they're not getting it. And again, it's going to be different for any seller, but are there any points that you say at this point you want to bring in somebody who really knows what they're doing to help you out?
It depends. I think you should decide early on what degree of help you want. I mean, there's no reason not to get at least a little help before even the first one. I mean, if you're 100% sure you can nail it without anybody's assistance the first time out, then go ahead and take a shot at it. As long as built into that decision, you understand that if the first one doesn't get you through, you at least need to get an hour of somebody's time. I mean, there are people who will book an hour of my time on my calendar, and they never officially retain me or hire me to write anything. We talk them through it. I look at their plan of action. I give them some feedback on it. That might be enough for a revised POA that gets them back on in the second attempt, and they've really only gotten an hour's worth of help. For people that don't understand how these processes work and they don't think they have the capability to write the sort of plan that will get accepted, why do a low percentage play? Why just take a stab at it unless you kind of don't care if you get the account back or not? I mean, most people want the account back. So if the account doesn't mean that much to you, and you don't view a consultant's assistance as an investment, then have at it, and then just accept with if the result is that you can't get yourself back on, accept that you chose that path from the beginning. But don't play both sides, right? Don't say, I want to try this 6 times and then bring in Chris to rescue me. I mean, I still get contacts from people like that. But I mean, I'm at the point where I really want to be involved from an early stage, if not right away at the beginning. I'm not always involved on the first appeal, but get me in for the second or the third. Beyond that, you've sort of shot yourself in the foot and you might be beyond saving.
That's a really good point. And two quick points to that as we start to wrap up. And the first one is you have to look at what's at stake. If you're doing $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 a day, it might not be worth your time to try and do it yourself and play around on it because of the amount that's at stake. If you're doing a couple $100s a day and you can afford, to spend some time doing some research, that's great. But the other aspect that is really important, if you have diversified strategy, diversified marketplaces, if Amazon gets shut down even temporarily, it's not going to be the worst thing. It takes the pressure off. You've got other marketplaces that are bringing in income. And I had a company that, they very diversified strategy. They got shut down in Q4 on Amazon, and their other marketplaces took up all the slack and increased the revenue that they needed. So they were able to deal with it much more methodically. It wasn't irrational. You do not want to be in a situation where Amazon is the only basket where all of your eggs are in. Chris, one last question in terms of seller performance. At what point would you say you could reach back out to seller performance if you hadn't heard from them? 6 hours is not enough time, but if it's been a couple days, what's your recommendation in terms of reaching out to them if you haven't heard anything back?
Typically if it's been a few days, there are queue levels that vary. It could take them 3 days, even not Q4, for them to get back to you, just because their headcount is low, their team capacity, their workflow. They could have a backlog. It really depends on how many people are suspended that day or week. They could have lots of appeals more to go through that day, that week than anticipated. So you don't want to wait forever because your contact could have been lost in the ether somewhere. But you don't want to start saying, well, we're so desperate, we're so anxious, we have to just send another contact every day and hope for the best. If you send them 6 contacts, they'll dump 5 of them and they'll read 1, and it might not be the one that you wanted them to read. They'll answer that one and annotate your account and move on. If they think that you haven't really spent a lot of time on it, you're just rushing through it, then they rush through what they do for you, right? They're kind of rushing anyway, but at least if they have the sense that you've given them something they can work with, they at least should and probably will take at least a little bit of time to review it and give you a fair shot. So the people who are, I get a lot of this. Last time I wrote to seller performance, they got back to me within 10 hours, within 6 hours, within 2 hours. That means absolutely nothing in terms of how quickly they will get back to you today when you email them. It's all about queue levels. So there are a lot of emails in the queue. It's going to take a lot longer than the day they got back to you in 2 hours. It's 100% insignificant how quickly they got back to you last time.
Yeah, I know there's been a couple cases where Amazon hadn't provided us all the information, and it took pushing a couple times where we reached out to them and after a week or so started pushing and badgering a little bit and saying, hey, what do we need? And eventually they give us more information. We were able to address that. And you mentioned that.
I'm not against pushing seller performance if they've cut a trouble ticket and assigned you to one particular person and that person's not around and they're just sending you generic messaging saying, we'll continue to review this and get back to you. I mean, you can't wait for that. You eventually have to say, okay, I gave you some time to review it. It seems like there's nobody working on this ticket or on this contact, and you need a fresh contact from me to at least request an update. There's nothing wrong with doing that.
And you mentioned that you can't add an attachment to the initial plan of action. Would you recommend sending an email to seller performance following that with an attachment so that they have that documentation once you get your initial?
It depends on the suspension cause. Sometimes in the notification itself, they won't ask you for supplier information. Like I said before, authenticity letters, information about your manufacturer, trademark registry, whatever it might be. They won't ask you for those documents. So there are times where we just submit the plan. We don't attach anything. We use the appeal button. You can, if it's absolutely necessary, you can send supplemental documentation to seller performance from the primary email associated with your account. Things do get missed, things do get lost, but they shouldn't have a problem as long as you're contacting them from the right email address, locating which account those documents belong to.
You also mentioned that it does need to come from the primary email address on the Amazon account. So make sure that you have access to that. And that even if it's not the business owner who's sending that, that you are using that primary email to contact with seller performance.
Yeah, if you don't get a response, if you get nothing over days, then maybe you sent it from another email address and didn't even notice it. Sometimes people don't get a response because there's no account found.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me. Again, you can reach Chris at ecommercechris.com, and we've got a special offer for you. If you would like a sneak peek of a former Amazonian's proven method for crafting successful Amazon appeals, Chris will be giving you his insider secrets on successfully communicating with Amazon. And if you want to understand how to write an appeal the right way, you can save $40 if you join before February 28th. Chris, thank you so much for your time and appreciate your insight in all this.
Yep. Thanks, Shannon.
Appreciate it.